Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back with another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Censored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have Trump posts once a minute in the unhinged late night spree from the dailybeast.com, posted by Donald Key, and that's a cross post from the No Filter News subreddit. And yeah, personally, it seems like you could share this exact headline pretty much any time over the past decade, and it'd still probably be accurate. I personally don't think you should go on unhinged late night posting sprees on social media, but, if Trump wants to justify doing that, I think he should be able to. I think that's freedom of speech. Freedom of speech doesn't mean you should be always, saying it, but, if you want to justify it, we should be able to justify it as long as you're not hurting anyone else. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have 600 ICE agents were sent to fucking swarm Canal Street. However, hundreds of New Yorkers got there first and surrounded them, posted by CH4Locks, and that's a cross post from the Chaotic Good subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is, if the people want to stand up to the state, they should be able to. I think, I don't really care for ICE. I would rather have it be done by a private militia, deportations be done by a private militia, and only go after violent criminals instead of just anybody. But ultimately, the government has a legal monopoly to enforce whatever laws it wants to. With that being said, Reddit only cares for this because it's the in-group doing it, not the out-group. If it was the out-group doing it, a bunch of MAGA people standing up against one of the more woke branches of government, Reddit would think it's the worst thing ever, but of course, since this is their side doing it, they think it's the greatest thing ever. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have new Marino bill to outlaw dual citizenship. Senator Bernie Marino from marino.senate.gov, posted by Ninja Lover, and they added another brain-dead Republican initiative that helps no one. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is, citizenship should ultimately be whatever people are willing to define it as. If people want to make it so that you have to buy your citizenship, ultimately it comes down to whoever controls the definition of citizenship, which often falls upon the government to determine what it confers. And yeah, if the government wants to outlaw dual citizenship, ultimately they can justify enforcing whatever rules they want to. Personally, I think the idea of citizenship is, I think it's kind of an inherently hierarchical structure. I think if people want to be citizens or identify as those citizens, they should be able to, but I don't think the government should be determining who is a citizen and who isn't a citizen. That's very much be up to individual discretion. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have former Air Force Secretary Bradley will be court-martialed under normal circumstances from thehill.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and they added several other former U.S. government and military leaders have also dubbed the double tap attack a violation of the country's law of war manual. Bradley is slated to provide a classified briefing to lawmakers Thursday as members of Congress continue to investigate the Trump administration strikes in the Caribbean. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is, the U.S. military, since it has the legal monopoly of its force, can ultimately justify getting away with whatever it feels like, and ultimately sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. Of course, Reddit, they think it's the worst thing ever because the out-group's in power currently, but I think if the in-group was still in power, they'd either shrug it off or say, oh, look at the Dems, look at whoever the Democrats are having as the Secretary of Defense, standing up to authoritarian Venezuela, and it just goes to show you that Reddit only cares about its narratives and political agendas rather than actually having any consistent beliefs at all. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have citizenship requirements to change for millions of Americans under new bill from Newsweek.com, posted by FlimsyHal5563. And yeah, personally, as I said earlier, the government can determine whatever requirements for citizenship that it wants. Personally, like with everything else, as I said earlier, citizenship shouldn't be under the control of the government. Citizenship should be ultimately determined by individual discretion. If you don't want to think someone's a citizen, you shouldn't be forced to think they're a citizen. But, ultimately, I think it's very much something that the government shouldn't be involved in, because, the government can determine whoever it wants to as a citizen will taking away anyone's citizenship it disagrees with, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have GOP steps up pressure on American Medical Association physician payments from WashingtonPost.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and they said a key Republican senator is demanding that a major medical organization explains how it upsets industry payment ranks, adding urgency to a growing political fight over how doctors are reimbursed. Senator Bill Cassidy, Republican Louisiana, the chairman of the Senate's Health Committee, on Monday sent the American Medical Association a list of questions about how the lobbying group devises codes that are used to bill for medical procedures and services fees associated with that work and the organization's broader agenda. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is, the American Medical Association should be independent of the U.S. government, just like every other association and group. And, if they're part of the government, that'll allow the government to have more control over them, like this bill they're trying to pass. It wouldn't have any control over them if they were independent, and that's very much the libertarian position. You have groups like the American Medical Association be independent of the government, because ultimately the government is just going to justify enforcing its will on whatever groups it has control over, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Bye-Bye Costco. MAGA erupts after retail giant sues Trump over tariffs, from InFirstNews.com, posted by Donald Key. And that's a cross post from the No Filter News subreddit. And yeah, if Costco wants to sue Donald Trump, I think they should be able to, as I went over in, I think, the last episode. But with that being said, ultimately, I think, the government shouldn't be giving some companies treatment over others. If the government, if they do rule in favor of Costco, that'll be what they're doing. They'll be getting reimbursed for tariffs, but other smaller companies won't be, and that's very much I think would be wrong. Even if I personally am against tariffs, I think all companies need to be dealt with equally under them. And yeah, that's my thoughts on that. Next, we have Napolitano. Hexif should be prosecuted for a war crime, from TheHill.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I think pretty much all the U.S. government should be prosecuted for war crimes. But of course, Reddit only wants Hexif's head because he has an R next to his name. If he had a D next to his name, they'd either sweeping it under the rug or saying how good it was that he was bombing the drug boats. And yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Colombian family files first known formal complaint over deadly U.S. strike in Caribbean, from CNN.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and they added, the family of the Colombian man believed to have been killed by the U.S. airstrike in the Caribbean. His file was believed to be the first complaint against such attacks with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, IACHR. The petition filed Tuesday by U.S. human rights attorney Dan Kovalik alleges that Colombian fisherman Alejandro Carranza was killed when the U.S. struck his boat off the coast of Colombia on September 15th. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian perspective is, the U.S. shouldn't be just relentlessly drone striking people, but, ultimately the government has a legal monopoly and force to justify whatever it feels like, and also sometimes there's nothing you can do about it since the government controls the legal system as well, and that's very much why I think we need to have get rid of government, at least have small government as small government as possible, so that the inherent power disparity is as small as possible. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have DOJ sues Vermont and 6 other states in sweeping push to obtain unredacted voter rolls, from democracydocket.com, posted by CH4Locks, and that's crosspost from the Vermont subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think if the DOJ wants to sue whoever it wants to sue, I think it should be able to. But with that being said, ultimately, voter rolls are something that voting is a lot like citizenship, as I talked about earlier. The government can determine who is and isn't a voter, whoever it feels like. And yeah, I personally don't really care for that. But, ultimately, I think the libertarian position is, you should have as open a system as possible when it comes to voting. I would argue that since both sides are increasingly saying that elections we lose are fraudulent, only elections we win are legitimate, we need to have stuff like open ballots and as open voter rolls, and all voter rolls should be open. But, of course, Reddit, since Vermont's a liberal state, Reddit's gonna agree with whatever Vermont says, even if, they're the ones who are currently complaining about fraud, for all the, something is wrong 2024, the election was rigged against Kamala, but, so they should want open voter rolls. But, But of course, Reddit, they don't have any consistent beliefs other than DNC good, RNC bad. Next, we have top compassionate minds cheer deportation for a decision made by a Freemonth-old 39 years ago from posted by CH4Locks, and that's cross post for the top minds of Reddit subreddit. Top compassionate minds cheer deportation for a decision made by and that looks like a link to the conservative subreddit, and it's a thread they did from 39-year-old man in the U.S. since he was 3 months, taken by ICE during green card interview from ABC7.com. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that. But ultimately, the government can justify throwing out anyone who the country who they feel like, since they have the legal monopoly on the use of force to do so. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Supreme Court appears to torn over evangelist challenge to protest ordinance from thehill.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and they added, the Supreme Court on Wednesday appeared torn over Mississippi evangelist challenge to the city protest ordinance he was previously convicted of violating, seeming hesitant to cast aside a conflicting past ruling that, but worry of restricting the path to legal relief too heavily. Gabriel Oliver, a Christian street preacher, asked justices to greenlight his laws to question constitutionality of an ordinance that restricts demonstrations outside a Brandon, Mississippi amphitheater, which he claims runs afoul of his religious rights. And yeah, I think the libertarian position is, if the property owner of the amphitheater doesn't want him preaching on their grounds, I think they should be able to do that because, as with a lot of stuff, libertarians believe in property rights first and foremost. But with that being said, you do have an argument that his freedom of speech is being violated, especially if he wasn't inside the theater building itself. So ultimately, the Supreme Court's going to justify ruling however it feels like, and ultimately, I can only hope that that freedom of association and freedom of speech are both protected in the ruling. Next, we have Democrat announces articles of impeachment against Hegseth, in parentheses, will admitted war crimes be enough to shake the GOP loyalty promised to dear leader and his cronies, from Axios.com, posted by CH4Locks. And yeah, as I said earlier, I think they should all be impeached and charged for war crimes, but Reddit only cares about Hegseth being impeached and charged for war crimes because he has an R next to his name. If he had a D next to his name, Reddit would say this is a partisan witch hunt. But of course, Reddit only cares really about what the letter next to the name is rather than what the person is actually doing. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And I think we're gonna wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.